Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to another episode of our strategy series. In this episode, we are going to talk about the syllabus and the preparation strategy needed for disaster management for your mains exam. So let's begin the discussion by taking a look at the trend of questions that have appeared from disaster management in previous mains papers. But before we begin, let me point out that disaster management happens to be a minor subject under GS paper 3. Under GS paper 3, disaster management finds a mention and it happens to be a minor topic for our mains exam. But however, this is no reason to neglect the subject because every year consistently we have got one or two questions amounting to almost 25 marks. So there is no reason for you to be complacent with regard to this subject because with the right strategy you can easily cover all the key topics. And any question that comes from disaster management, you will be able to answer them easily. So in that context, disaster management does become very important for your mains. And also remember, disaster management is a multidisciplinary subject. It is closely linked with other subjects like geography, international relations, environment and ecology, etc. So whatever you study under disaster management will also help you directly in the other subjects as well. So with this in mind, let's take a look at the trend of questions that have appeared. In 2013, we had one question in GS paper 3. In 2014, a couple of questions were asked. And for the next few years, we were getting just one question directly from disaster management. But throughout this period, we had related questions in geography and in other topics as well. So that's why I insisted that disaster management is a multidisciplinary subject that can help you in other topics, in other papers. But from 2019 until the latest exam, which was held in 2022, just a few days back, consistently two questions have been coming, and hence you need to pay attention to the subject. Because what you have to study for disaster management is very limited. With limited preparation and with the right approach, you can score really well and ensure that you pocket these marks so that you're able to increase your chances to appear at the interview. So if you look at GS paper 3, UPSC tells us very little about the subject. Usually in main syllabus, most of the subjects are well defined. The specific topics are well defined. But this is not the case for disaster management. In GS paper 3, UPSC has only mentioned disaster and disaster management as a part of the syllabus. But this alone is not helpful for us to understand which key topics to be studied and which should be the focus area. So to understand which are the key areas that we need to focus on, we need to take the syllabus and cross-reference this with the previous questions that have appeared in mains examination. So when you take a look at the syllabus and compare this with the previous questions that have been asked, we can shortlist some of the key topics. The key topics are listed over here, so we are going to take them up one by one and understand what are the areas you need to cover under these topics. Always begin your preparation for disaster management by covering the basic concepts. You need to be familiar with the definition and the basic concepts related to disaster management. For example, you should know what is a disaster. How do you define a disaster? How is it different from a hazard? What is vulnerability? How does vulnerability determine the impact of a disaster? Then what's the concept of resilience? How can you make a region or a community resilient against the impact of a disaster? And what's the concept of risk reduction or disaster risk reduction, which is currently a priority area in disaster management? So such key concepts have to be covered, and you can expect direct questions on these concepts in your mains. Later at the end of the session, I'll show you some of the previous questions that have come, and you can realize that from these concepts, direct questions have been picked. So what you need here is conceptual clarity on these core concepts. This will help you understand what disaster management is all about. Because disaster management is not just about studying about different disasters. That would be more of a geography-oriented preparation. In this subject, you should not only know about the disasters, but you should also understand the governance aspect of it. you should understand how the administration should approach disaster management. How should we put in place a structured response for disaster management? So to gain that understanding, you need conceptual clarity on these basic concepts. These are the foundational concepts of disaster management. So once you cover these basic concepts, then you can start focusing on the different types of disasters. This is where you approach disaster management from a geography point of view. You can divide the disasters into natural disasters and man-made disasters and focus on all the major disasters. For example, earthquakes, tsunamis, landslides, floods, forest fires. Try to cover the basics of all these disasters. What contributes to these disasters? What's the vulnerability of India to a particular disaster? You can even categorize these natural disasters into different categories, such as hydrological, meteorological, geophysical, etc. Focus on those disasters which specifically affect India, like cyclones, tropical cyclones, floods, urban flooding, forest fires, earthquakes, tsunamis. So cover all these disasters and understand them from a geography point of view. Primary focus is on the causative factors. What's the natural phenomena that causes these disasters? That should be the priority for you when you're understanding the different types of disasters. Focus on man-made disasters, such as industrial disasters, including industrial accidents, wars and conflicts, and as well as chemical, nuclear, biological, and radiological disasters. So all these key disasters have to be covered, and you should also understand whether man-made factors or anthropogenic factors, are they somehow contributing to natural disasters? Essentially, you need to understand the impact of human activity, human development, industrial development on our environment and ecology. Is this driving more disasters around the world? That's the question. The answer is yes, because industrial development and human activities in general has contributed to climate change and global warming. This has introduced permanent changes in biogeochemical cycles, and we are already witnessing a direct impact on our environment and ecology. So this has aggravated the frequency and as well as the amplitude of extreme weather events such as droughts, forest fires, floods, heavy rainfall, cyclones. So such weather and meteorological phenomena have gone up in their frequency and impact. So you need to understand the interconnection between man-made activities or anthropogenic activities and how they are contributing to extreme weather events. So once you cover this, you need to focus on India's vulnerability towards each disaster. Identify which regions of India are vulnerable to different types of disasters. For example, the east coast of India is more vulnerable for the impact of cyclones and tsunamis. The Himalayan belt and the Indo-Gangetic plain is more vulnerable for the impact of earthquakes. Even with regard to landslides, northeast of India, Himalayan ranges and the Western Ghats are prone to landslides. So you need to identify the vulnerability profile of India by looking at the hazard maps of India. For every hazard, there is a separate hazard map, a profile created for India. So you can identify the different regions which are vulnerable for different types of disasters. Then you need to do the same with regard to the rest of the world as well. You should have a basic idea about which regions are hit by which kinds of disasters. For example, read about the Pacific Ring of Fire, how the Pacific region is highly vulnerable to various disasters. What kind of disasters occur in the Indian Ocean? Why is California, Mexico region vulnerable to earthquakes and forest fires? So such a basic understanding where you blend geography and disaster management is essential to cover these topics. Once you cover this, then you start focusing on the disaster management part of it. You approach the subject from a governance point of view and start understanding how these disasters can be better managed with better governance. This is where you have to understand the evolution that has happened in disaster management post 1990s. Around the world, before 1990s, disaster management was seen as an ad hoc part of governance, meaning there was no structured response towards disaster management in countries around the world. Countries were just reacting to disasters. There was a very reactive response. Only after a disaster happened, only then governments would respond with emergency relief and emergency aid. They would just carry out search and rescue, provide basic relief, and everybody would forget about the incident. There was no comprehensive approach, integrated approach towards disaster management. But post 1990s, there has been a complete transformation in the field of disaster management. The United Nations has led these efforts. There are few conventions which were held. There are few international frameworks which were created, which provided for a more structured response towards disaster management. From a reactive approach, the world started moving towards a proactive approach. So today in almost every country, there is a structured disaster response mechanism, and these standards, these global standards have been implemented, and you need to focus on something called the DM cycle or the disaster management cycle. Instead of looking at disaster management as a one-time initiative, today, thanks to UN and thanks to efforts of various countries, various governments, there is a cyclical approach towards disaster management. So disaster management is being treated as a cycle with focus on pre-disaster phase, during disaster phase, and as well as post-disaster phase. These aspects were previously neglected. Previously, that is before 1990s, disaster management was being implemented only in the during disaster phase. That is when a disaster was about to happen or when a disaster had already happened. So focus was just on emergency relief and emergency care, not beyond that. There was no consideration for pre-disaster planning preparedness, no focus on post-disaster management. So these concepts have been introduced under the disaster management cycle. Today in pre-disaster phase, there is focus on prevention, mitigation, preparedness. During disaster, there is focus on better response, effective response, so that the best relief and best care can be provided to the affected population. There is extensive focus on post-disaster management as well, where the priority is given for long-term recovery, rehabilitation, compensation, etc. So this is a very, very important concept that you need to understand. Once you gain hold of this concept, then you can focus on the global framework that has been created by the United Nations to promote a structured response towards disaster management. Beginning from 1990s, conventions were held in Japan, starting with Yokohama. This brought out the Yokohama strategy, the first global response towards disaster management. Later in 2005, this was followed up with the Hyogo framework, and in 2015, this has been replaced by the Sendai framework with focus on disaster risk reduction. So you need to focus on these conventions, these strategies and frameworks, and understand the goals and targets that have been laid out. You need to understand the principles of these global initiatives. With this understanding, you can start focusing on disaster management in India. You should understand how India is implementing these international standards and how India provided for a formal disaster management architecture through the Disaster Management Act of 2005. So you need to look at this key legislation that provides for structured disaster management in India. Understand the key provisions of the Act, understand the architecture, the institutions that have been created through this law. Then focus on these key institutions. Understand the whole disaster management architecture in India and how the Disaster Management Act created a three-tiered structure beginning from the NDMA, the National Disaster Management Authority at the national level. Understand its roles and functions. Understand the functions of NDRF, the National Disaster Response Force. Focus on the role of Ministry of Home Affairs and other key institutions and organs of the Government of India which are involved in various aspects of disaster management. Identify the early warning and forecasting agencies that provide these services with regard to few disasters. Then focus on the state level architecture, starting from SDMA, the State Disaster Management Authority, and finally focus on the district level to read about the district disaster management authorities. So you need to understand this entire disaster management architecture that has been created through the Disaster Management Act. Focus on the institutions, their role, their mandate, their functions, and the key initiatives that they have taken up. Also focus on the financing aspect of disaster management, because the DM Act provides for establishment of funds such as the National Disaster Response Fund and the National Disaster Mitigation Fund. So you need to comprehensively cover the DM architecture and institutions in India so that you thoroughly understand disaster management in India, which has been implemented from 2005 onwards. Once you do this, you come to the last part of your preparation where you focus on current affairs and try to carry out an analysis of recent disasters happening in India and around the world. Treat them as case studies. So whenever there is a major disaster, either in India or abroad, read about these events mainly through current affairs. For example, Kerala floods, which happened recently, the massive forest fires in Australia, in Brazil, in California. Focus on disasters in the Himalayan states that have occurred recently, like Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh, etc. Read about urban flooding, which has increasingly posed a threat to Indian cities, mainly due to poor planning. Because recently many Indian cities have been hit by serious cases of urban flooding, which is a result of encroachment of the drainage basin. So cover all these recent disasters that have happened with examples, treat them as case studies, look at the response of the government, response of various institutions, identify the factors responsible for causing these disasters, and this is more than enough to answer any mains question. Now let me just show you a few sample questions that have come in previous papers, so you can be completely confident about this strategy and approach. See, we had this question in 2013 related to vulnerability and risk assessment. So this question cannot be answered without having your basic concepts right. You need a conceptual understanding of what is vulnerability, what is risk assessment. And you should be able to relate this with an example, with a real world disaster. So once you develop that understanding, it's actually a very easy question. You can write a very logically structured answer, so you fetch maximum marks for such questions. We had a question in 2015 dealing with earthquakes in the Indian subcontinent and how India's preparedness for mitigation has been lacking. So this requires an understanding of the concept, the static part related to earthquakes, particularly earthquakes in the Indian subcontinent, and you should understand India's preparedness and mitigation strategies towards earthquake. You should know about our disaster management approach. You should also be thorough with recent developments in this field. Through current affairs, you should be able to identify the gaps in India's disaster management approach towards earthquakes. For example, earthquakes have a higher impact in densely populated urban areas. The vulnerability in urban areas is higher towards earthquakes, mainly because the buildings that are constructed, they're not earthquake resistant, they're not earthquake proof. So the focus as an administrator, from a governance point of view, should be to enforce the building bylaws, ensure that any construction that happens in seismic areas or earthquake prone areas should be earthquake resistant. So you need to develop this comprehensive approach where you read the concepts, understand India's weakness, India's vulnerability, and link this with latest developments. Look at this question from 2016. It focused on the institution, the National Disaster Management Authority, and the guidelines that it has come out with. So this is a recent development, and you should be familiar with such institutions, their structure, its mandate and initiatives. Once you know that, you can answer this question provided if you have read about cloud bursts in places such as Uttarakhand. You can see how the static part is being blended with current affairs. So you need to be aware of NDMA's guidelines for various disasters such as cloud bursts, landslides, etc. And you should be able to link them with recent disasters. This question was specifically asked because that year Uttarakhand was badly hit by cloudbursts and floods. So that is how questions are picked by UPSC. Look at this question from 2018. It dealt with the international framework such as Sendai framework and Hyogo framework. How India is implementing these measures to achieve disaster risk reduction. Again, you need the concept. You need to know what is disaster risk reduction. You need to know what is Sendai framework, which was in news. You should understand how it replaces the Hyogo framework and how India is implementing these standards. So without a sound knowledge of the static and the current affairs, you won't be able to write an answer to this question. But with the right approach, as we discussed, this should be a very simple, straightforward question and you would be able to score well. Another question from 2019, dealing with a basic concept like vulnerability, how you categorize disasters based on vulnerability, and discuss different types of vulnerability with reference to disasters. This is purely a static question, but you can make your answers more interesting by providing the right examples from current affairs. Take examples of recent disasters and explain how, as vulnerability goes up, the impact of a disaster also goes up. Right? So such illustrations have to be provided by linking the static with current affairs. Another question from 2020. Discuss the recent measures initiated in disaster management by the Government of India departing from the earlier reactive approach. So for this, you need a holistic understanding of evolution of disaster management in India. As I explained earlier, you should understand how governments were ad hoc in their approach prior to 1990s and how they have become proactive and implemented a structured response post 1990s. In the case of India, you should understand the transformation that has happened after the DM Act was introduced in 2005. So if you have this conceptual understanding, you can easily explain the changes that have happened in India with regard to disaster management. Then finally, I would like to show you one last question from the latest paper from 2022. Explain the mechanism and occurrence of cloud burst in the context of Indian subcontinent. Discuss two recent examples. Again, the question is dealing with a type of natural disaster. That's the static part here, the conceptual part. But you should be aware of at least two recent examples. Recent examples of cloud bursts in Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, etc. would help you write an answer to this question. So that is what I'm stressing upon. When you're preparing for disaster management, you should not just focus on the static part and the concepts and the definitions, but you should also ensure that you're thorough with current affairs. If you're able to do this, you will definitely score well and you will write good answers for all the questions that come from disaster management. So what are the sources needed for your preparation? The sources are very simple. Don't rely on any textbook, any standard book. It's not needed. Absolutely, you can rely on basic material like NCRTs, current affairs, and few standard websites. This is more than sufficient to cover disaster management comprehensively. Start with your basic geography NCRTs. They cover disasters in detail. So develop a conceptual understanding of disasters. Read about different types of disasters and the concepts that I was mentioning. Then visit the NDMA website. Go to the website, navigate through the website and download the National Disaster Management Plan and Policy that has been brought out by the NDMA. This document runs into around 200 pages each. You need not sit and read the whole document. Glance through the document, read the important sections and make notes from it. This will provide you all the material needed for disasters, the concepts related to disaster management and disaster management in India, including the architecture and the institutions. Along with that, visit the website of the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. This will give you all the information needed regarding the global framework on disaster management. It will give you enough points on Sendai framework, Hyogo framework and Yokohama strategy. And finally, be regular with newspaper reading. This goes without saying. For any subject, current affairs is absolutely critical. So read any paper, be it Hindu or Indian Express. It's up to you. But ensure that you cover key topics related to disaster management and make note of important developments. Make a note of recent disasters that are happening. identify the factors which contributed to it, then identify the response of the government and what measures can be taken in the future to prevent or to mitigate the impact of these disasters. You can even make ready notes on these recent cases and use this as a case study for further enhancing the value of your answer. So this approach is more than sufficient to cover this subject comprehensively. So on this note, I would like to bring my discussion to an end, and I hope you like the initiative and do support us by liking these videos, share your comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.